Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Culture versus Clinic, Transforming Patient Care Through Embodiment. My name is Noelle. I'm the panel organizer, and we'll do some introductions in a minute. We'll start with introductions and context on our methods and approach. We'll have a short piece on biosemiotics. And then we will share some experience in the obesity disease area and talk about some work that we've done on treatments and how they were represented in clinical discourse and in popular culture. And then we'll have a discussion at the end talking about a number of different therapeutic areas, conditions, healthcare challenges, and what the implications are for transforming patient care and through embodiment and using and applying biosemiotics as an anthropological method with key takeaways at the end. We'll start with introductions. First, Malcolm Evans.
I'm Malcolm. I've been in this semiotics business for since the late 1980s. My academic background was in literature and cultural studies, and I was one of the pioneers in applying semiotics to market research.
Hi, everybody. I'm Natasha. I'm a semiotician and a brand consultant, and my background is largely in the not-for-profit space, looking at marginalisation, quite a lot of health charities. I come from a design and design thinking background, so because that generally involves designing 3D stuff, I'm always interested in how wider cultural ideas combined with our own sensorial reading of something can drive our thinking and decision making and behaviour. So there's an intersection with behavioural science there.
Hi, I'm Yogi, and I'm an environmental philosopher and public health scientist working at Erasmus University Rotterdam in the Netherlands and at the University of California, San Francisco in the Environmental Health Initiative. My interest in the conjoining of semiotics and biology and health comes from a background working in medicine, and also looking at how biosemiotics can be applied to the human organism. That is, how human everyday activity and interactions are shaped by our evolutionary psychology and sociology, our instincts, and how the role of environment plays in our health and well-being.
Great. And I'm Noelle Theodosio, as I mentioned. I founded Luminous, and we're operating together, this group, as a diverse group of individuals bringing different perspectives. So my perspective is as a career consultant, working initially in market entry strategies, helping global organizations enter new markets and understand different cultures and how different categories operate within those cultures. Primarily, I was working in consumer goods initially, and found semiotics as a very useful tool in my toolbox to generate insights around consumer experiences, beliefs, and deeply held values that we couldn't get from doing traditional market research. I found myself in healthcare and the healthcare setting, working with pharmaceutical companies, biotech companies, medical device companies, and noticed that that need was there too, to really understand more deeply the lived experience, and saw a blind spot in the industry. And here we are today. I've connected this group together to pursue bringing biosemiotics to the industry, and it certainly helps with understanding exclusionary discourses, as well as how, as Yogi put it, how biology, psychology, and sociology can work together to inform better healthcare experiences and better health outcomes. So this is a very interdisciplinary group. I'm going to pass back to Malcolm to provide a little bit more context.
Okay, so this is a brief history of application of anthropological thinking in consumer research. And Patricia Sunderland and Rita Denny actually wrote a book on this in 2007, where one of the things they note is that ethnography, which was established in consumer research, I guess, in the 1990s, was a bit different in the applied version from academic and ethnography, in that ethnology in the applied version was grafted onto a very psychology-based culture, and it became a supplement to psychology rather than an introduction of culture into the world of market research. It became talking to consumers, focus groups, and depth interviews, plus observation, things done in situ. So we add some observation to enrich the psychological dimension. But what they do note in the book is that culture did appear elsewhere in applied market research, and this came in the form of the next build, Noel, please, semiotics, that around about the same time as ethnography emerged in market research as a primarily psychological discipline, here came semiotics as well as a cultural discipline, responding very much to the need in the marketplace as markets globalized and brands became global mega brands, the need for an expertise in cultural understanding, in cross-cultural understanding, in building strategies that worked across cultures, and in having an expertise in language, symbolism, in communication codes, in, for example, advertising and design, that could help brands build their communications across cultures. So semiotics emerged at about the same time as applied ethnography, but semiotics was the branded applied discipline, if you like, that added the culture to the basis, the strong basis of psychology in consumer research. So the semiotics that we developed in the applied consumer research world was not academic semiotics. It was academic semiotics in a cut down, very much applied, what we would call actionable form, but it was also academic semiotics with other things added in an improvisatory way from, for example, cultural studies. So this model, the residual dominant and the emergent, came from the work of the cultural critic Raymond Williams, and we applied it as a tool for tracking cultural change and change in brand communications across time. And this was used in combination with other mapping tools, the residual dominant and emergent being used to track the evolution of communication in context across time. But we also used a tool that familiar to many people, I'm sure, in anthropology, Graymass's semiotic square, as a way of mapping codes, brands, cultural developments at a particular moment in time. To give you an example of applied semiotics, this is an early piece of work from the 1990s for a pharmaceutical company who commissioned a cultural study of migraine, where we found that what was a debilitating condition for many sufferers was culturally essentially trivialized, as the word migraine itself derived in the English language from a Middle English word, megrin, which means a whim, which means something imaginary. So the very word was in its historical dimension culturally contaminated in a way. And we found that in migraine communications, the sufferers were invariably women. And the condition was, the pain was represented in a very surreal code, which suggested imagination, which suggested hysteria in a way. We've only got one example of this code on this chart, but this was very much a staple of migraine product detail aids for physicians. Imagery was that the sufferer was always female and the pain was always represented in this what we called metaphorical rather than literal or metonymic way. So to cut a long story short, the evolution that the semiotics proposed for the client who was developing a neurologically sophisticated brain science-based, more advanced new generation treatment for the condition was to move from the female to something in the patient code, to move from the female to something we suggested initially androgynous, but it actually moved fully into the male. And in the pain code, to move from the surreal to something, in this case, the execution was something much more substantial, an earthquake, an Italian village devastated by an earthquake, which can be put back together by the almost miraculous power of the male physician prescribing the treatment. So we've moved from a culturally female to a culturally male or non-gendered domain in terms of representation of the patient. And we've moved from something diffuse and surreal and fantastical to something much more specifiable and scientific and solid, if you like, in terms of the metaphor of the pain and its treatment. So what we see in this early example is that the physiological is coming in as well as the cultural. But as semiotics developed, I think what we were finding was that it worked very well for things like fast-moving consumer goods, but it was a tough sell to talk to pharmaceutical companies about the cultural dimension, because what was missing in the semiotics was a kind of hard science grounding. So when academic semiotics evolved a biosemiotic dimension, it was a kind of no-brainer for applied semioticians working for brands to want to bring to the table, to add to the psychological and the cultural expertise that we had by now established, an ability to talk in a more sophisticated way with about the molecule, about the physiology, about medical treatment and care. So biosemiotics, had it not existed, it's almost as if the applied discipline would have had to invent it to innovate and extend its range.
The field of biosemiotics combines the semiotics of Charles Sanders Peirce, the theoretical biology of Jakob von Uexküll, and the systems biology of Gregory Bateson to look at the contrapunctal relationship between organisms and their environment. So from a human point of view, looking at us from an ethological perspective, biosemiotics looks at all of the, you could say, inside of the body, from the skin in, interactions in our various consortia of cells, and our skin out interactions with the elements, with the senses that we take in, and our interactions with other organisms, humans, and the more than human world. The field of biosemiotics is akin to or allied with the extended evolutionary synthesis in biology, which says rather than being gene-centric, that our genes are heavily affected by the interactions we have in the world around us, and that we can have not only epigenetic effects through these interactions that potentiate or depress our genes, but also that when we are exposed to various things in the world, the entire composition of our microbiome can change, which in turn changes us. So we all know, C.P. Snow's two sort of two camps of the humanities and the sciences. But like applied anthropology, biosemiotics also aims to reopen this dialogue across the sciences and humanities to look at how meaning is created through the interaction between organisms and our environment and each other, and that this is a co-construction. And we know that anthropology has biological anthropology, but biosemiotics is a bit different insofar as it sees agency and action all the way down. So for example, we can expand our notion of communication to account for chemical signals, pheromones, for example, as reasons for why people act on things, looking at attention to different visual displays, how different colors can help different moods be elicited, even if we're not conscious of it. Looking at how auditory calls around us, body postures, and stereotyped behavior can influence us in ways that we previously were not privy to. And how do we take all of this complexity in the ways in which we are influenced to act, and the ways in which meaning is made through all of these aspects which we haven't perhaps attended to previously, and bring this into the human experience. So that's part of the applied anthropological sense of biosemiotics. And insofar as this relates to a medical model, we now see this mapping on quite well with the established paradigm in medicine of the biopsychosocial approach to well-being, right? So that it's not just about our biology, it's not just about our psychology or our social situatedness, but rather that our health is predicated on how these all come together and supervene on one another. However, this model, even though it is the accepted model in medicine, has not yet made its way through to a lot of the products that we are seeing. We're aware that the current focus of a lot of pharmaceutical interventions, and this would include devices as well, are on the physical health and neurochemistry level, rather than keying those in with behavioral aspects, notions of social support or standing, and how these can affect the uptake or the efficacy of these treatments. So from this biopsychosocial model, we have created as a team a new biosemiotics model for looking at pharmaceuticals and the pharmaceutical interactions for better outcomes for patients. And this takes this model and expands it to include not just the physiological, but also how that works with the environmental and the neurological. And that these different aspects of our being, the psychological, developmental, cultural, and social, are infinitely complex. We can never map them 100%, but by having more insight into these drivers of health and how something that may not have even been diagnosed as relevant, they are too complex for us to fully understand for even a single individual, let alone for entire populations. Nonetheless, by being aware of these different aspects, we can understand how we can better support pharmaceutical interventions for better patient outcomes by looking at things that maybe physicians hadn't even diagnosed.
So we've taken a little bit of a stroll through applied semiotics in the context of anthropological methods for market research, informing product development, informing communications, and landed on this biosemiotics approach. I'm going to take a shift now and give an example of some work that we did in the obesity space, which actually was work that took place before this model became clear to us as useful in addressing some gaps. In the obesity space, when we started tackling an understanding of, let's say, the readiness culturally, socially, of the marketplace for the GLP-1 category of drugs to treat obesity, the dominant discourse in culture was very focused on personal responsibility as it relates to one's weight, evoked in a very dehumanized, depersonalized manner. The images on screen now are various examples. And while these aren't all the expressions that were in culture at the time, they were the heavily entrenched expressions of people with overweight, and a general attitude to larger people as being lazy and undisciplined was part of that dominant culture. Now, as we applied the semiotics approach and looked at the codes and the trajectories, the residual dominant and the emergent within culture, and we created a semiotic square, we did see lots of evidence in the broader discourse around new ideas related to psychological factors and social factors and biological understanding related to, for example, our stress levels, our moods, our the amount of sleep we get, having a huge impact on our physical bodies, explicitly on our weight, but generally on our metabolic health. And so while that was emerging in the cultural discourse, what we found when we undertook an analysis of the clinical discourse, we found a fairly considerable gap in language and ideas. The clinical discourse was characterized by very mechanistic approaches to metabolic health in general, but specifically to overweight, bariatric surgery being one example, There was also some discourse around obesity related to very metaphoric to climate, that we are experiencing a global pandemic, but it was very distant from the human experience. So while in the popular culture, the emergent ideas of weight, including body positivity, and of our ideas of our bodies was shifting, in the clinical, it was quite stuck, is probably the best characterization of it. So on this journey of looking at the contrast between the cultural and clinical discourse and the expressions evoked using a more traditional semiotics method, it became very clear that we needed to bring in more considerations and factors, so biology and psychology, more effectively in our analysis. And in doing so, as I said, while we didn't have a complete concept of all the nodes of the biosemiotics framework that we just presented, there were some obvious implications that popped up that speak to exclusionary discourses and speak to challenges represented by that gap that prevent us from being able to treat the whole person and achieve a better outcome, because we're not taking all those factors into consideration. So as an example, one major implication, and this is not exclusively relevant to obesity treatment, it's actually much broader than that, but as it relates to clinical trial exclusion criteria. So in general, there are many clinical trials that exclude individuals with higher BMI, which has an implication for treating larger folks and people with metabolic disease when it comes to all sorts of different treatments. So the bias is coming through in the science. Additionally, and I think this is a really big theme that speaks to the need to bring these three dimensions together. In general, scientific validation lags emergent ideas in our culture. We saw that very clearly in the obesity analysis. So ultimately, what we discovered was that a new language, more strongly rooted in the biological mechanisms that had been more clearly understood through the development of a GLP-1 treatment, was really necessary to engage patients and providers in understanding obesity, metabolic disease, and its impact on our biologies and physiology, and on the role of a GLP-1 treatment. So that is an important implication. And then lastly, the implicit bias in the healthcare system, whether that was evidence from the way healthcare providers treated patients with obesity when it came to other conditions, or whether it was the notion that it is the job of the healthcare provider to consider and support patients on their journey to achieving the best weight health they can. And many patients, we're aware now of many patients, even today, experiencing these yo-yos and their ups and downs in their weight for having personally undertaken quite a lot of effort and lots of diversity of diets and exercises and programs sold in the mass market that are unsuccessful for them. And they find themselves at an impasse with their healthcare provider because there is no established way to have that conversation. It's not built in our culture. It's not built in the medical education system. And so that also is a big implication going forward, again, both for obesity and other conditions.
So I think what was particularly interesting about that obesity case study was that it managed to identify a really unhelpful exclusionary cultural discourse centered around this idea of individual responsibility and willpower, and that was very much getting in the way of patient outcomes. And it felt that the way to challenge that was to frame obesity as a biological condition, as a disease, as something that was absolutely not about individual choice. I think that was really fascinating to see, a very clever kind of interplay. So I suppose my key, if I was to start to think about key outtakes really for the thinking biosemiotically, one of the big observations is, and exciting observations, is that by integrating or reintegrating this biological narrative, we can actually change the cultural one. And I think we've always assumed if you want to change a cultural narrative, you create a new cultural narrative. That's really exciting to me, because I think we've pitched biology against culture for a really long time, and we've created this false opposition, I guess, between biology and culture. And we've been quite nervous of over-pitching ideas around biological determinants, rightly, actually, because they've been weaponized, I think, in some very dangerous ideas around race and gender. And I think what this shows us is that biology is very much part of and impacted by and an ingredient of culture. So a framework that actually allows us to really explore that and really examine the interplay between the two. It feels like feels A, powerful, and B, truthful. So what this makes me think of is all the obvious next places to go in terms of this kind of thinking, and my mind immediately goes to the mental health space, because it feels like that's a world where already we're talking a neurobiological, psychosocial kind of language. And I'm wondering how thinking in this way might help us deliver treatments and pathways for things like depression. So I suppose my question back to the panel is, did any of you have a view on areas of health that could really benefit from or even demand this kind of thinking? You raise your hands, I will call on you. Yogi.
Sure, thank you, Natasha. So I think if we look at the case of Alzheimer's and dementia, it's quite clear that when you have somebody in an environment that they're familiar with, that a lot of times we cognitively offload some of the ways in which we make sense of the world through things in our environment, right? All living beings do this, not just humans. We have trees that we recognize as that's where you turn to go home. There are these external indicators, whether it's smells or physical objects or things that we touch, that remind us in a almost synesthetic way of who we are and our orientation in a society, right? So this orientation that's not just through a rational or a sort of preset ordering that we have received passively, but something that we are in intimate relationship with. And so in biosemiotics, there's Ivar Pura has this notion of semiocide, of the death of meaning that can happen when people are taken out of their environments, you know, that separation between place. And Glenn Albrecht calls it solastalgia, right? This nostalgia for ecologies that no longer remind us of who we are in the ways that we remember, right? So we're nostalgic for places that no longer exist. So with Alzheimer's, for example, when we're treating patients, as much as possible, how can we have someone be treated in their home, where they know the contours of their kitchen counter, they know if they're getting up in the middle of the night, how to walk with the lights off to the bathroom. These simple things that we all take for granted, but are really important when certain parts of our faculties are no longer able to do extra work for us, right? And so in brain chemistry, we would say the basal ganglia is that sort of automatic part of us that really relies on our external environment, our natural and built ecologies, which inform us of where we are and thus who we are. And if we take people out of their contexts, the idea of a homelessness in the world, of not knowing who you are because you have an unfamiliarity with your surroundings, is, I think, something that we really, in the mental health space especially, could stand to learn a lot from.
Yeah, I have another example from some work we did, and I guess I would put a fairly practical lens on this, and that is in the rare disease space. Two thoughts actually. So in the rare disease space, when patients are diagnosed with genetic conditions at birth, and they evolve through life with that disease, obviously their needs and their lived experience evolves. You know, they develop as people, they take on sports and partners and have children and take on new careers and so on and so forth. And just the general thinking about, or generally thinking about the impact of a lifetime therapy on a patient, the role that therapy plays in their life and their ability to live a life with therapy, and how that might need to change. I mean, again, we're talking about, when we're talking to the medical device industry and the pharmaceutical industry, we're talking about shifting their perspective from pure biology to biology in context. The reverse is also true, of course, but if you take that first version, but biology in context, and you think about how someone develops their developmental path in life, one therapy is not necessarily going to do it. And I'm not aware of any drug development process or medical device product process that incorporates age and life stage into use, maybe practically for certain things. But are we thinking about a therapy not just as a clinical biological intervention, but as an intervention at a time of life for certain people? And to make an even more fine point on that, in some specific work we did on the rare condition of growth hormone deficiency, and making the point about the reverse being true, that our contexts have a huge bearing on our biology, we learned a lot about the experience that children have with their caregivers, parents, peers, school teachers, providers, when they do take growth hormone and they start suddenly growing in size at a pace that is maybe expedited, but more importantly, their chronological age starts to meet their physical size in a way that it didn't before. Whereas previously, before taking a growth hormone treatment, you would be physically smaller. And the contrast and the way that our society treats a small person, even if they're 10 years old, if they're the size of a 5-year-old and we're treating them like a 5-year-old, that has huge developmental, social, and social impact. And we've also understood that naturally it changes the relationship that they have with the people around them. Most notably, I would say their families, their parents, and their peers. And that relationship changes as a result of their physiology changing. And that has a huge impact. So is that being taken to consideration as well? So those are a couple of examples we have from our project work.
I was thinking that the last point was especially interesting, because when you have a therapeutic intervention that's successful, in many ways, part of what you have to provide support and a framework for is the psychological impact of that therapy being successful. So whether that is dramatic weight loss or something like that. I've done quite a lot of work in the deaf community, and when cochlear implants are given to particularly young people or children for the first time, it can feel, it isn't necessarily a fix in terms of their experience of the world. It can feel actually like an assault, where there has to be a period of counselling and training and quite pragmatic kind of behavioural intervention, where those cochlear implants can be used in a gradual way so that the person starts to feel comfortable and not as though their entire identity has been eradicated. And they and then gradually they start to feel empowered enough to use their hearing as and when they want to use their hearing. There's been quite a lot written in the deaf community about the psychological, emotional, and mental impacts of cochlear implants, and how that could never just have been a case of a technical fix. So I think for sure that notion of always making sure, even when you're giving a biological solution, that the surround sound support on that looks across to the other areas. In neurodiversity, they call it pills and skills. It's like you would not give a child, you should not give a child stimulant medication without ensuring that they are being trained in the appropriate skills to integrate that into the right kind of areas of their life. Because it's, you know, it's one thing to have something to help you focus, but if you still don't actually know what you should be focusing on, or you can't necessarily make choices around prioritizing what you should focus on, then actually that becomes potentially more of a danger than a fix. I had a question actually, Yogi, for you around the Alzheimer's thing, and I think it's also a broader question, which is this: sometimes I wonder whether a therapy or whether the experience of a disease, if you can see and map on something like the framework we had, the direction of travel, its emergence, is the condition always lived in the biological realm, and therefore there's never really been a need or a desire to start to look for those more sociocultural environmental fixes. And you have something like Alzheimer's, where there isn't currently a cure, pharmaceutical cure. A lot more seems to have been invested, and maybe more respect accorded to the sociocultural environmental fixes, and that might well stand that condition in good stead for when the pharmaceutical breakthrough finally comes, because it's given a really good foundation, which means those two things can now be integrated. I suppose I was just wondering if we think that's the case for, if that's the case generally, and if there are other conditions that.
Well, yeah, I think the point you're making is precisely, sort of the meta argument that we're forwarding here, that the biological and the cultural are entangled with one another, and that if we rely just on one or the other, that we'll be missing a large part of the story, and we'll be sort of essentializing the interactions, right? So on the one hand, with obesity, while it's great that we've sort of taken a large part of the blame and guilt and shame outside of the cultural domain and into the biological with GLP-1s, and I think that is a great advance, socially and anthropologically. That is part. It's never going to be 100% of the story, right? And so I think for Alzheimer's as well, we rely on sort of these cultural extirpations, or these spandrels that help us cross the boundaries between this process that has biological and cultural components. For example, we know that dancing is the best protector, neuroprotectant for dementia, right? Reading is great, but actually moving your body, perhaps paradoxically for us, is even better of a protector. So I think that for many, as Noelle commented on human growth hormone, or if we look at sickle cell, where there have been great pharmaceutical advancements in the last decades, these are best utilized in cultural contexts, they're also supportive of the individual in a community setting, that remind people to take their medication, that normalize the sort of issues, that people with these conditions have, so that it becomes something where we can reduce a lot of the social burdens that we put on people with disease, and instead take almost a more traditional indigenous role of seeing these people who provide unique insights into our culture, right? Because we're all situated in certain ways, right, that both allow us, but also prohibit us from understanding other aspects of our reality. And so the more sort of diversity and integration of people with some of these diseases we can do in our society, the more we'll understand the disease from the first person perspective, from the inside out, and the better the treatment matrix will be, so that it's not just cultural, it's not just pharmacological, it's both and more.
One of the codes, one of the emergent codes that came out of our work in obesity was that we called it lab coat holistics. And the idea was that what was around in alternative medicine, which then became called complementary medicine, is now more and more in the mainstream, that it's becoming part of mainstream science to have all of these different dimensions playing in at once. And it's mind, body, spirit. I think we should break out of the culture versus biology, because it's not just a binary. It's many different things in motion. And behind that, I think there is the project in biosemiotics to, if you like, heal the Cartesian divide between the mental and the physical, and the whole cultural panoply of institutions that exist around that. Yogi mentioned earlier the CP Snow 2 cultures that exist in education. So I think to be encouraging among clients and in healthcare generally, I think a more fluid, more holistic approach would be part of our kind of project going forward. And from the work we did on obesity, it feels that med schools are perhaps, the part of the equation that need most help to, loosen up and move the teaching project forward in that sense. My main insight when I reflected back on the work that we'd done, in a way, I'm going back to the binary here just for a moment, but there was an insight supported by a number of studies that only 20% of health outcomes are attributable to clinical care, and only half of that 20% comes from directly the operation of the drug or the device. So the other 80 or 90% of contributory factors are contextual health behaviors, physical environment, socioeconomic or cultural factors. So the applied semiotic work that I did on migraine in the early and mid 90s aimed to understand and upgrade in cultural and communication terms the debilitating condition that was trivialized as a women's problem. Migraine was seen as a bad headache with a few extra bells and whistles. And the condition was often discussed under headlines like, "Not tonight, darling, I've got a headache." So that's a good early example of applied marketing semiotics being brought to bear on overcoming exclusionary discourses and on positively affecting patient care. Our recent biosemiotic work on obesity, on the cultural codes and clinical discourse, which is constantly under review and being updated by us, is similarly engaged with these issues of exclusion across a broad swathe of that 80 to 90% of non-clinical factors impacting on the outcome, from fat shaming and blaming the patient for their condition, to addressing food poverty issues in terms of pervasive marketing of ultra-processed obesogenic food and drink, and impaired access to healthy, nutritious ingredients, and the power of corporate lobbying and the failure of regulation features here too, of course, in the analysis of obesity. COVID-19 showed us how a pandemic can be addressed politically when taken seriously. Obesity was the pandemic left for too many years pretty much to its own devices. And in terms of its major role in determining who was going to die from COVID, it was, as has been claimed, obesity was the pandemic within the pandemic, or the real pandemic. The upgrade of applied semiotics, which contributed so much in terms of looking more holistically to applied biosemiotics, is significant in that it lets us bring that 20% of health outcomes attributable to clinical care into the analysis as well, to fully incorporate the physiology and the functioning of the molecule into their psycho-socio-cultural contexts, into that rich cross currents that transcend that Cartesian divide. And engaging critically with this dimension, the role of the drugs in managing hunger and satiety, for us looking at the science rather than just taking the science as a given for a cultural project, was an important part of the work that we did for obesity. And it was a key to helping pharmaceutical companies roll out the new generation of high-profile anti-obesity therapies that have been so much in the news, based on, you know, what they do in the body, what the molecule does in the body, GLP-1, and its impact. Where we are looking at impacts potentially comparable to those brought about by the COVID vaccine. You know, I think we need to shift the mindset from thinking that this is just big pharma stereotypically medicalizing everything and coming up with decontextualized technical fixes. You know, that if you bring the physiological back into the semiotic mix, you add something to a sort of world where everything feels like placebo, or everything feels like social construction, which I think is the drawback of a purely social science approach, incorporation of rigor from the exact sciences.
I thought what was really fantastic there, Malcolm, at the end, where you landed on the COVID vaccine, was in many ways a beautiful encapsulation of biosemiotics at large in the field, because what happened with the way that we critically engaged as a community and as a mainstream people with all the various different mechanisms of actions and the ways the different vaccines worked and how they worked on our different body systems, and whether we were going for Pfizer or, you know, the integration of a very scientific discourse into mainstream culture, and the negotiation actually of which brand of science we were supporting and which we believed in and which was perhaps right for us and our various identity groups. I don't think we'll leave that behind. I think that has effectively now become our new normal. So that suggests that this very pretty framework that we're pulling together and the thinking that we're doing around biosemiotics is already out there, you know, as a creature in the wild. It's not a rarefied thing that we're revealing to the world. And our job actually is to do it better and do it more often with more people. So I think that's probably a good place to hand over to you, Noelle, on your reflections and outtakes from today.
Yeah, sure. So I guess we will, I will kind of turn reflections into our closing and approach it as a call to action. And first, a call to action, I suppose, to the world of life sciences, the industry behind the development of therapies, diagnostics, devices, for whom these insights can radically transform their approach if integrated. And we see that as a potential at every stage of product development. Naturally, there are biological mechanisms that need to be isolated and focused on, but they need to be quickly recontextualized and repeatedly recontextualized at every stage of their development and at every stage of their engagement. When it comes to a client company that we might work with, we would be very focused on how, once they've developed a product, how they go to market with that product and how they support patients and providers, treaters in the marketplace with that product. So a call to action for the industry from that point of view. And then a call to action to this audience of anthropologists to take into consideration the interdisciplinary opportunity of what biosemiotics represents, what it can bring, and taking a critical perspective or a critical lens on how we've come from ethnography through an initial sort of, let's say, era of applied semiotics exclusively to advise clients in commercial space on marketing, to expanding that much further and beyond marketing into our understanding of the human experience more broadly. And the very motivating aspect of that is that a biosemiotics approach would clearly lead to a better quality of life for everyone, taking all aspects biopsychosocial into consideration. And it would also clearly lead to better health outcomes for those who need those health outcomes. So that's another call to action and a motivator. This slide is also an invitation to everyone who has spent time with us today virtually to reach out to continue the conversation. Our emails are on the slide, and thank you for spending the time with us, and we look forward to connecting in different ways soon.